And as you'll see, I like to mumble through this first bit just to give people a bit of time to catch up and join and say hellos if they're around. So if you are joining us, we are a minute late. Apologies. If you are joining us, please say hello so we know that we're not talking to ourselves. If you don't say hello, then I just know you're watching in silence and would presume we're talking to 1,000 people because we're that important. Me and my co-Chuckle brother are here to entertain you all and finish your afternoon off, hopefully finish your afternoon off with some insightful information around what one of the biggest companies in the world is doing for their wellbeing strategy. So that could be pretty cool. And I'm looking forward to hearing. I mean, I know Paul pretty well now, and he's got some very insightful knowledge. So keep tuned. What is the time? We're just 32 minutes past. So if you're with us, and I said, if you are with us and you have any questions, please just comment. I think if you have to comment in the comment section that comes up here, we're on a separate link. So excuse if I don't see it. I've never done it to myself, so I don't know. Anyway. I'll stop mumbling now. We are a minute in. Paul, thank you for joining me. I'm looking forward to this, as I said, supporting employee wellbeing at Accenture as one of the biggest companies in the world. Must be a challenge, and I'm looking forward to hearing what you are up to and how you're overcoming that challenge. So, hi, how are you?
Well, I'm good. I'm a bit aggrieved that you stole my joke about the Chuckle Brothers.
Sorry, mate.
You started off with grand larceny of comedic material, but other than that, I'm all right, thank you. It's obviously heading towards the end of the working day in the UK. So after this, I'll be going to spend some time with my 3-year-old, which is usually entertaining. So yeah, I'm good.
You got enough toys, as you can see behind. Sorry, do you call them toys or do you call them figurines or keep collectibles?
I'm not precious about it. I think toys is a perfectly legitimate description because that is what they are. And yeah, they just make me happy, and I've got too many of them, or not enough, depending on your perspective. My perspective leaning more towards the latter, and it's always a good background for getting people when I am working from home, as I'm doing today. It's a good background for starting a conversation.
I think I agree with you. I think it's a wicked background. It's probably the best I've had. I said that to you before we even started, so it's not a lie either. So I'm going to do a quick introduction to myself, just so if anybody's coming from your network, they know who I am. And then I'll be kind of me, the boring bit out of the way. So if you don't know me, my name's Rich, or AKA Dickie. Paul will know me as that because he knows me from the gym. But I'm the founder of Employees Health and a high performance exec coach. The aim of Employees Health is to help companies improve their well-being at work, as well as helping their individuals improve their health and well-being. And then along with the exec coaching, helping their senior leaders perform at their very, very best. And that's my aim, helping people become their very best selves, live long, healthy and happy lifestyles. That's the boring sales pitch out of the way. Let's get into the interesting bit. Paul, could you give me a quick introduction to you and to what you do?
Sure. Hello, everyone. My name is Paul Duggan. I've been at Accenture a very long time, I think 23 years now. I don't normally look like this, but men's health is one of the topics that's important to me. So participating in November this year as best I can, and you can judge how well that's going from a visual perspective. I joined Accenture as a graduate and worked in the client-facing part of the business for many years. Probably about 7-8 years ago, and I think we'll get a bit more into this later, I became involved in what was then our emerging mental health network, and through that, about 4 years ago, transitioned into our HR practice to lead health and wellbeing in the UK. And then in Easter this year, I transitioned to our global health and wellbeing team, which has been sort of fairly newly shaped. It's not to say we weren't focusing on health and wellbeing globally, but we brought it all together into one team over the last 18 months or so. And I joined that team in Easter this year. And my slightly workshop job title is Global Health and Wellbeing Lead brackets EMEA. So part of my responsibility is our European region and some additional countries that we associate with that, including the Middle East.
Yeah, wicked. Fantastic intro. So I'm going to dive into your story a little bit more. So you said 7 years ago you joined the UK Mental Health Alliance at Accenture. And I know your story a little bit. I don't know how much you're comfortable going into that, but could you share your story around why this is important to
Sure.
you? What you do?
Yeah, I'm sort of very relatively well practiced talking about it, but thank you for asking. So, and I tell this story so often, I have to sort of occasionally go back and check that I've got the years right, because obviously the years change over time. So I think it is 7 years ago, 8 years ago, I burnt out, basically, in short. I was chasing promotion internally. To do that, I was doing work I didn't really want to do, wasn't particularly interested in, but that I thought was the right work to get promoted without really questioning what that would mean for my career longer term. My personal life wasn't going very well. And then I'd already been diagnosed actually with anxiety and depression at the start of that year. But then one more thing went wrong. And I just woke up one morning and thought, I can't go into work. And I'm very lucky that I was very well supported through that. So I was signed off for about 10 weeks in the end, fully supported by the firm. In those 10 weeks, I realized a few things. Turns out I didn't realize everything because there's some more stuff I figured out later on. But I sort of realized, one, I was kind of done with traveling. I'd been on the road for about 14 years. I'd really enjoyed travel with work, but I'd got to a point in my life stage that maybe it was starting to leave me with a bit of a sense of home, like, feeling a bit anchorless, not really it's not really tied anywhere. So that was one realization that maybe I needed a bit of a shift from that perspective. And the second thing I had to come to terms with working with the council was actually I've probably struggled with anxiety for my entire life, which would have been useful to realize at 7 rather than 37. But for me, that's kind of the way the cookie crumbled. Um, that was incredibly helpful because I think understanding things doesn't necessarily make them go away, but gives you much more leverage over them. You can look into them. You can do things to help yourself manage them. So I think that changed my attitude to kind of self-care quite significantly. Returning to work, the vast majority of people were really supportive. Probably one or two people weren't. I wouldn't say they were typical in any way, shape, or form of the organisation, but I had a couple of bad experiences. In general, though, I was really supported, so I was helped to find a new role that involved much less travel, and helped me a bit with personally, with sort of from my perspective, with balance because it was quite near to where I lived. And then at the same time, I did get involved in our mental health network, which at the time had already been started, but they needed more people to put their hands up, and I was one of the people that put their hands up. And my sort of big passion there was really, one, creating a space where people can talk about mental health, which won't be a new story. A lot of people are very passionate about this. Within that, I think helping men talk about it, because a lot of the people I'd seen up to that point, and I think broadly often still see talking about it, aren't men. I think there's less good role models in the space for men. And really to help people, because I think for me, because I had this realization very late in life that I've been struggling with mental health, and I just kind of assumed that was part of who I was almost. Broadening the conversation hopefully helps people to have that realization. And then the second thing really was making sure that internally we are doing the right things so that when people are having a challenging time, we minimize those bumps in the road. And as I say, broadly, I think I was very well supported by the organization, but I could still see some areas for improvement. And that's been a passion of mine, continues to be a passion of mine. And pleased to say I work for an organization that's very receptive when people make suggestions about things we can do. So became very involved in the network, working with our then sponsor, who's a brilliant lady called Barbara Harvey, who's since retired, fully deservedly, to run our internal learning sort of function we had, and became qualified as a trainer for our internal allies program, and still do that training to this day. And then ended up doing so much of that I was probably pushing my luck a bit with my day job, and then very lucky that this opportunity came up in corporate functions for me to sort of take some of my client-facing skills and apply those internally to designing our wellbeing program for the UK, which I did for the last sort of 3 years up to March this year.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of been in terms of my passion, it's been a sort of continuous journey in terms of me. I've also experienced postpartum depression, which people with prior history of poor mental health are more likely to experience. Another example of where actually awareness is not very good. So, people will, and I think understandably, often assume that postpartum depression is only experienced by the person that's given birth to the baby, but it can be experienced by anyone in a child raising situation post birth. And then most recently, just to sort of complete the set, about 2 months ago, I was diagnosed with ADHD, which I think in turn goes back to explain some of the anxiety, because one of the things I've realized is that I manufacture stress almost to kind of keep myself focused, because I know I'm not very good at keeping myself focused, but that obviously is quite a tiring way of keeping yourself on track. Um, and quite fortuitously, I was part of a team that had introduced neurodiversity benefit within the UK business about 18 months ago, not knowing that I would then be using it a year later.
Mm.
And I'll pause for breath there. But yeah, lots going on, lots of reasons, lots of personal reasons I'm passionate about it. But also by sharing and talking about it, you can see how that helps other people, and then people bring their stories to you, and that is very inspirational in terms of why this is such an important area.
Yeah, and if you know my story, it's why it's passionate to me as well, right? I had somebody who, at the start, just before Employee Self was born, um, somebody who was a man who was silent on this and then completed suicide. So my mental health journey started, and diving into this and understanding why that happened, or try to understand why that happened, and why then he didn't reach out, and then why all of those different things. So to me, it's understanding. And so from what you're saying, I think it's why it's so important that the more people talk, the more people share their experiences, makes people understand that that's not just a them issue. It's everybody goes through this stuff, and that there is support out there, and talking out sometimes is the most powerful thing, right?
Yeah, and we did a piece of research around 2019. So, like, the most common statistic you'll hear about mental health is 1 in 4 people in any given year will be diagnosed. But I think in a way that kind of downplays the size of the issue, because that's, okay, so that's 1 in 4, quarter of people. That almost implies most people aren't affected by it. But the piece of research we did in 2019, which we did with YouGov, and was a national survey, so not just Accenture, as well as asking about diagnoses, we also asked about common symptoms. And asking on that basis, we found that probably, I'm trying to remember those off the top of my head, but I think about 60-ish% of people had experienced some form of poor mental health in their lifetime. And then we asked people about supporting friends or family, and 80% of people had some experience supporting people through poor mental health. So you put those two figures together, you actually get 9 in 10 people in some way have been affected by poor mental health. Now, in some ways, that's a really scary number, but in other ways, I find it weirdly reassuring, because it means if you walk into any room and there's 10 people in that room, including yourself, and you feel you've got something to say about mental health, 8 other people in that room will probably have some personal experience of it. So it fundamentally is something that, and this is not to say we don't want to reduce instances of it, it's not to say we don't want to limit the impact of it or take care of people. Fundamentally, it's normal to have a hard time with your mental health. So the idea that there is stigma about talking about mental health in that context doesn't really make any sense, but we have to acknowledge that it's still there.
Yeah, we have to. Yeah, 100%. It's an interesting topic, isn't it? And I think this is the reason why when we booked this in, part of the reason why we did it was for Mental Health Day, and the reason why it's today is because Mental Health Day was on Sunday, and we wanted to share this story and right, understand that men's health is men's mental health as well, and it's a topic where we all have a narrator. That narrator can either be positive or can be negative, and at different points in your life, he'll tell you different things. And so it's important that we understand that those things sometimes can be challenging, and that there are things and ways we can manage that and make sure we can change that mindset. And that's whether that's internally through doing bits for yourself, or whether that's reaching out and getting that support as well, right?
Yeah, and I think the biggest lesson I took away from coming back was, I think I was talking about this at an internal event the other day where we were talking about men's health. And I think I realized coming back, there was no way I could kind of come back to work and get to where I wanted to get to. And I'm specifically not saying get back to where I want to get to, but get to where I want to get to on my own without, I couldn't get a different job in the same company without sort of giving some people the rationale why. I couldn't make sure that I was doing the things that I now understood I needed to do to manage my anxiety without telling some people why. And just what I fundamentally found was, in almost every case, the support and sort of care and love you get from people when you tell them you're having a difficult time is actually overwhelming in a very positive way.
Mm.
Um, so if you're kind of are worried about reaching out to people, I think the best advice I can give you is to try it, because most people will respond with kind of empathy and kindness.
Yeah,
And in the rare instances where they don't, go and find someone else.
yeah, 100%. 100%. Okay, let's get on to your role. You've been doing this role, or you've been in the health and well, I'm not talking about this new role because I know this is new and there's still lots going on there and building that team together. And it's kind of an extension of what you've been doing. You've been in this role for, you said, nearly 3 years, nearly 4.
Mhm.
What have you been doing? What's been kind of what have you done? What have you been doing in that time?
So think about the UK role. So the UK created 2 new roles at the time, to augment an existing wellbeing role. So I was very lucky that I came into a role where I had a team. So working with 2 brilliant ladies, Sheila and Roxanne, as well as our partners in the benefits part of the business. But Sheila and I started with comic timing, I think 2 days before COVID hit the UK. So we went from probably having a plan of like spending, I don't know, a couple of months really kind of workshopping and strategizing and figuring out what our long-term plan was, to throwing that out the window and just going straight into action mode, which, and very much not trying to be flippant about the impact of sort of COVID, obviously, which was huge, but probably for us, actually, in the end, I think probably helped because we just had to get on and do it versus spending a lot of time sort of navel gazing and thinking about it. So the initial focus for the first 6 months was very much around just how do we help our people. And we did a number of things. So, a big one, and there's a chap called Mark Britton who did a very good job in this space, was like moving all of our mental health training virtual, because it used to be face to face. And there are real benefits to do mental health training face to face, but there are some downsides as well, especially from a scalability perspective. And also a bit of a bias towards people in certain locations, whereas now anyone can attend. We, lent very heavily on our partners. I think I know we're going to talk about tips at the end, but one of my sort of big tips in a wellbeing role is to sort of really make the most of the people you're working with. There's a bit of a narrative I don't love at the moment about wellbeing is not benefits, and it's not benefits, but benefits do have a part to play in wellbeing. And I think there's a bit of a demonizing them I sometimes see on LinkedIn, which I don't think is very helpful, because one, it potentially dissuades people from using things that can help them, and two, there's kind of presumption that if people roll out a benefit, that's reflective of their whole wellbeing strategy, which I don't think it is. But so leaning into our vendors, so our insurance partner were very supportive in terms of getting us access to psychologists, so we could put on sessions about how to cope, helping talk people through the emotional journey they were likely to go through. We started measuring our people's sort of mental health through a survey that we developed again with YouGov, just focused internally, so we could track the impact COVID was having on people, lockdown was having on people. And we maintained that for a few years afterwards, although that's now being folded more into a global measurement approach. And we used that to guide some of what we were doing and keep leadership informed on the impact. And what we saw through that was a number of interesting things that then actually did go on to inform our kind of wellbeing strategy going forward. So, one of the big things that came out was actually there's often an assumption with supports that people don't know about them, and I think often people don't know about them. But there's actually often the case where people do know about them, but they're scared to access them for certain reasons. So there's fears around perhaps privacy, which are generally unwarranted because all that stuff's managed very carefully. There are fears that people think they can't be helped, which is almost never true. There's people making the wrong priority decisions, so saying I haven't got time. So that helped us to kind of craft a series of messages and campaigns internally to target those things more directly. And then as we started to not come out of COVID, but I guess move into more of a steady state of dealing with it, that's when me and the team started to look more at our kind of wellbeing landscape, and was it clear to our people what support they had, how they can access it. Did we have the right level of sponsorship in terms of driving sort of behavioural change? And in some cases we did, some cases less so. We identified some quite sort of significant gaps, what we thought were gaps. So one area was menopause, where's obviously been an emerging narrative. I think we were hopefully towards the front of that in the UK. Another area was neurodiversity, which I've mentioned. Another area was fertility, and then sort of subsequently men's health, and also financial well-being. So, long story short, we ran a series of projects to sort of build those into our landscape, but then at the same time, working with all of our vendors to try and make sure that everything joined up and made sense. So, simple example would be, we have a short wellbeing consultation we offer to everyone, which we're getting really good traction with actually, because it's in office. Obviously, we couldn't originally do it in office. It's half an hour with a physiologist, but those physiologists, even though they're from one vendor, they're trained on every sort of relevant support we offer from all of our vendors, so they can signpost people to them. And we've got that in place, I think, across our estate, that in the UK, I guess everything points at everything. So rather than people having to stitch things together for themselves, we do it for them. And then also sort of trying to play wellbeing more through personas. So rather than just saying, here's your list of mental health support, or here's the right things to do from a mental health perspective, trying to frame it through, if you're feeling great, that's lovely, but there's still things you need to be doing to look after yourself. There's still things you need to be doing to look after your teams. And we would still encourage you to check in regularly, because the best way you can look after your health, there's some great ROI on this from Deloitte actually. The best thing you can do to look after yourself when you're well is still to check in on a regular basis. Mm-hmm. Then, if you feel like you're heading in the wrong direction, what's the right things to support you? How can we intervene? And we have got a great offering called Healthy Minds Coaching that sits between I'm great and I'm in crisis. So we can kind of get people back on the right track, which has very positive feedback. And then you have crisis support, which is things like your EAP or your virtual doctor, but helping people to know that there's something for every occasion. And then there's also, I think, some really basic stuff, because whether it's well-being, whether it's inclusion, whether it's benefits, it's always stuff that it takes time to convince people it's part of the core of their job. So we've built up just a really good sort of drumbeat of events, of communications, so people know when they're going to receive it. And it's working when if you miss a month, or you're a couple of days late, people are chasing you for it. That's kind of the hallmark of success. And then people start to feel the organisation is taking it seriously, because they see it consistently and persistently. And then another thing, again, it's a tip ahead of the question at the end, is like learning not to be afraid of repeating ourselves, because whilst this is 100% what we're focused on, as I say, other people are juggling. They've got their client deliverables. They've got whatever's going on at home. You might get sort of 0.5% of their attention on a particular day. So you don't have to reinvent the wheel about how you communicate every sort of 2 months, even though you might be a bit bored of it, because actually those people didn't hear you the last time or the time before, but they are hearing you this month, which is good, because it takes some of the effort out of actually designing and doing these things. You just need to make sure then you're working your way around audiences systematically to get those messages across.
Yeah.
I'm trying to condense 3 years into a sort of 5 paragraphs, which is tricky.
I know you've been up for a lot.
Yeah, I think in terms of stuff we're proud of, I think we saw significant. So we've done the Great Place to Work survey for several years, but in the UK we saw double-digit increases in people's sense of psychological safety, double-digit increases, I think, in people's sense of financial well-being. Our mental health support was rated by our people as like 8 out of 10 in terms of people who found it helpful, which if you compare it to, I think AXA did a survey about 18 months ago and the average was 4 out of 10. And then alongside that, our mental health programs. So we've got, as of today, actually got the latest numbers today in the UK, we've got 2,900 mental health allies, which is about 20% of our UK headcount. So 1 in 5 of our people has gone through our ally program. So they're trained to listen, support people, and signpost them on to help and follow up with them. And again, we've measured the impact of that. So we know that people going through that feel more capable of supporting themselves and people around them. And half the people that go through that will have a mental health conversation with someone. Some people obviously come to that training more from a self-care perspective, which we're perfectly happy with. We don't force people to go out and talk to people, obviously, but if people want to make themselves available, they can. So yeah, so I think a lot to be proud of in that time. And then the stuff I think we probably didn't get to as much as I would have liked, but now looking at it from a global level, is measurement, especially. If I had my time again, I probably would have spent a bit more time baselining before we kicked things off. But then, as I say, we had the kind of panic of COVID. And yes, then sorry, the other two things that were really, menopause. There's been a really nice duality of in HR concluding we need to do something about this, but also in the business at the same time. We have this amazing group called the Men Warriors, and they created real momentum and like noise and positive noise about talking about the subject at the same time we were looking at it internally, and so that's led to us having I think the right supports in place and also the right community around it, and we were sort of certified as a menopause friendly workplace I think about 4 or 5 months ago now, which is something that and I'd say from a HR perspective we've been supporting this Men Warriors team ultimately, and it's really their success, but sort of very pleased to sort of have played a part in that, because again you can see the difference it makes to people, that they feel that is something that the workplace is acknowledging. And this is where again I get a bit frustrated sometimes about the sort of the benefits narrative, because actually the right kind of benefits and supports can help drive cultural change in a workplace. Rolling out a menopause support does, as long as it's a good one obviously, does signal that it's okay to talk about these things, that it's okay to bring this kind of stuff into work as part of you, and therefore it drives change. And more generally, that kind of change I think helps to drive broader workplace wellbeing change, because the more you can get people talking about what they need to be well, the more you can have that kind of collaborative discussion between you as an individual and the company or the project or the team you're in terms of what works for you, what works for them, and how you get stuff done. Because I do still feel in terms of work, well, we know in terms of workplace culture, there's a bit of a disconnect in terms of leaders. I think are actually probably see themselves as being receptive to well-being. Employees don't see themselves as being as supported. But I think a lot of that is actually driven by sort of sometimes fear-based behaviours versus reality. So how do you create a workplace? Creating a workplace where people feel safe to ask, or even as something as simple as saying, well, Thursday I need to leave a bit early to play football. Those are the conversations that I think drive workplace wellbeing, and any sort of supports you roll out that help normalise people having those conversations, I think do make a difference. It's not the whole solution, but I think we need to get away from this whole benefits versus culture conversation, because I think if you do it well, it all heads in the same direction.
Yeah, I can see how it has an impact.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a lot to talk about and a lot to try to process there. And as you said, you try to wrap up 3 years into a 45-minute podcast is probably tough work. But you've done a good job. Obviously, congratulations on making such inroads and such kind of impact into the stuff you've been doing with those numbers you shared earlier on. And it's interesting you speak about not just focusing on people in crisis, but focusing on everybody in the organization understanding it's a sliding scale, that even if you are okay, that as an individual, you still have responsibility to look after yourself and make sure that you are always thriving, and there's support for that. And there's always something else you can do and learn. And I think that's super important. It has a big impact. And we'll get to the measurement bit in a bit more detail, but the measurement piece is something which it's probably one of the tougher bits to really understand and get the head around, right?
Yeah, I mean, measurement's really interesting. And it's the space where I don't think anyone's fully cracked it. I think some people are getting there. We ask our people so often how they're doing. We have lots of information on how people behave. We have information through wellbeing vendors. The challenge we're working through at the moment is how do we bring all that together? Well, I think there's two questions. I think question number one is, for any organization, is where do you need information that's specific to your employees to drive your wellbeing agenda versus where can you just look at, for example, external trends? So if you look at national trends around, like the horrifying sort of data around movement, for example, and the impact of our lack of movement on non-communicable diseases by 2030 from the World Health Organization, including depression. How much, on the one hand, you can say, well, how much more do I really need to know than that to just assume that's a problem for my population and try and do something about it? But inversely, you need to know that you're actually having an impact. So, the advantage of the kind of external data point is you don't get into any considerations around privacy data or any of those kind of things, which, obviously we take very seriously. But it will never really bring you to a point of actually being able to pinpoint if you are having an impact inside the workplace if you're just looking at population data. So then you get to your own data, and it's a question of what you already have, because we don't want to be launching more surveys. We don't want to be gathering more personal data. So the question we're working through at the moment is, this is the data that we get from vendors. Are we getting the right data from vendors? Especially in terms of the efficacy of wellbeing supports. So yes, I want to know how many people are using it, but what I really want to know is that those people believe it's making a difference. So making sure that, our vendors are giving us a view on that and capturing that, as well as just telling us, how many people have signed up, which is a okay metric, but not a super insightful one on its own. Then you've got, and just to clarify for any Accenture people listening, any data we get back is fully aggregated, anonymized. We don't get anything about individuals. Then you've got data internally. So, for example, I guess, sick leave might be a good example. And then you do have sentiment data, so data from surveys. And the question we're working through at the moment is which bits of those data really are relevant to wellbeing, because some things may seem relevant, but don't tell you very much. Other things may not instantly seem like they're relevant, but might be. And then the question is, which of those things legitimately can we use to look at wellbeing once you factor in things like GDPR and other data restrictions, and our own appetite for risk around data, which is obviously very important as a company that needs to be trusted in terms of looking after not only our employees' data but our clients' data. And that's the journey we're on. I don't think we're all the way there yet, being completely honest. But I think we're getting there, and I think once we get there, we'll have a good pattern that we can talk to other people about. And I think that is the fundamental thing, is the tension between, I think, organizations' desire to look after the well-being of their people and organizations' desire to respect the privacy of their people and to be compliant with privacy law. That's the Gordian knot. And I think that's why it's taking longer in this space than maybe some people would like. Well, all of us would like, really, but it's important we get that right. And then the other thing it's important we get right is, for example, when we're talking to vendors, we need to get that design right first time, because if you start getting data from a vendor and then you go, oh, that's not what I wanted, the historical data becomes a bit useless because you changed data design. So yeah, so that's the journey we're on. That's one of my big focuses globally at the moment, and working with an amazing team of people on that. And it's just we're working in a very sort of modern initiative fashion, and we're hopeful we'll have something to show for it soon. But it's it's one of the most interesting things I've ever done, and I'm confident we will get there, and we'll get there in the right way.
Yeah.
But it's a big piece of work, absolutely.
Yeah, measurement takes time, right? And you can't just bring time to you. You've got to take time from when you've implemented for it to stick, and then how that plays out.
Well, I mean, that's the other thing, because I think when we get to the pattern we want to get to on day one, it probably won't tell us very much. What it will tell it will start to tell us things over time. Again, in a way that's completely respectful of people's sort of privacy, and only looking at sort of big trends. And then what we want to get out of that is, one, to know that the things we're doing are the right things. And I think we know that in a number of cases individually, but more from a macro perspective. And then two, sort of what are the things we're missing? And then three, ideally proactively looking for things potentially in individual populations or countries where we might just see something that, oh, we need to do something about that before it becomes a big problem. And it's not just with us, obviously, as I say, it's working with our vendors, working with insurance partners, and everyone's kind of chasing the same goal, and it's trying to make sure we're not also duplicating effort across those as well, which is one of the other challenges. And that's a nice challenge to have, that everyone's trying to solve a problem. We just need to make sure we do it in a partnerial way, which again we're working through.
Yeah. Got a question for you. Obviously, being such a large scale organization, what for somebody else, let's say in your role, trying to do the same for another large organization, what would be the kind of top three things you would look at when measuring?
Oh, that's a good question. I mean, it's terrible to say. It depends. I think it depends what your wellbeing strategy is, really. I mean, what you should be measuring is your strategy. So regardless of what your strategy is, I think in terms of, I mean, I think broadly there are three things you should be measuring. I think one is the efficacy of any support you have in place. So do the things you have in place work? Or depending on how you gather the data, do your people perceive them as working? I think the second thing is employee sentiment. So how are your people feeling? And I think the third thing, where it's legitimate to use the data, depending on how you capture it, is what are the things you can look at that are real meaningful indicators of well-being. So it might be, I don't know, how often someone's had a bit of feedback, for example. That might be a bad example, depending on what T's and C's you have around sort of feedback entry, because it needs to say the right things in terms of being used for wellbeing data. But there will be things you have that tell you about people's behaviour, looking at how those change over time. So yes, there's three things: the sentiment, the efficacy of your resources, and then things that tell you about how people are behaving. Those are the three things. Now, what you have to measure those will change, and how you measure those, whether it's by survey, whether it's by looking at data. In some cases, as I say, you could use external data. You might use data from insurers. Will vary depending on what your landscape looks like.
Yeah, no, wicked.
And what your data privacy team tells you you're allowed to do. And I say that with all due deference to our data privacy people, because they do an amazing job of making sure that our aspirations are, respectful of, the law in the nicest possible way.
Yeah, 100%. No, thank you. It's insightful, right? Because it's one of the things we probably can take up quite a lot of time if you don't have a guide or an idea of what that looks like. So we have touched on quite a lot. There's two more things I really want to kind of discuss with you. What the focus is now for the next year, 2 years, and what that kind of plan looks like for you. It's the first thing I want to go through.
Sure. So the way our global team works is, as I said, I've got a slightly workshop job title. So I'm part of the global health and wellbeing team, and part of my responsibility is looking after EMEA. So what that fundamentally means is I work on global projects, so projects that are for everyone globally. But part of my role is to make sure those things land and work from an EMEA perspective, and that EMEA has a voice in terms of what we're doing. So in terms of our overall strategy, our overall strategy anchors back to something called Net Better Off. So this is a piece of work we did, I think around 2020, to sort of look at just employee wellbeing, or how work can help people to be, as it says, net better off. And this was a huge piece of research, and coming out of this were 6 dimensions. So emotional, mental, relational, physical, financial, purposeful, and enjoyable. Now, not all of that sits primarily in the health and wellbeing team's remit. So purposeful and enjoyable, sorry, not enjoyable, employable. Employable, some of that's more about training, skills, about your individual role design. Relational, whilst it relates to emotional and mental, is also about, the sort of structure we put around people in terms of like having sort of people leads and mentors and your team dynamics. So the stuff that really sits with us from a sort of pillar perspective. I know everyone has the different pillars and breakdowns, and I don't think it really matters as long as underneath it you have holistic coverage, is like the mental, physical, and financial. So that's kind of, those are our sort of three big sort of focus areas, and we believe if we can get those right whilst working with our inclusion teams, our employee experience teams on some of the other aspects, that we will create the right, employee proposition, the right working culture. Within that, for me, the big focuses are how we take what we've done in the UK around menopause and scale that globally, which we've already got some good momentum in, the measurement piece that I've already talked about, and then financial wellbeing, which is something else that we kind of piloted in the UK, and we've just taken global. So in no particular, so we've talked about the insights piece already. So with menopause, one of our aspirations as a company is to be at gender parity 50-50 by 2025, which obviously now isn't very far away. Fundamentally, that means, as well as supporting menopause in the workplace being the right thing to do, we need to make sure that our female employees, especially more senior women, feel supported and want to stay. They're not being. There's a statistic, I think, that I think it's 1 in 10 or 1 in 8 women leave a job because of menopause symptoms, and we don't want that to happen fundamentally, and hopefully no other company does either. So we've done a really good job. Well, not we, our business, led by some amazing people, have built this menopause support group in the UK, looking at how we can scale that globally and how we can support those groups so that they've got the right content, the right insights to be able to create safe and supportive communities for people who need somewhere to come and talk. Because I always think there's a difference between saying it's okay to talk about something in the workplace doesn't mean you have to come in wearing a t-shirt saying, I'm going through the menopause. It means that you can talk to the right people when you want to. And for some people, it might mean that, and that's absolutely fine. But for others, it might just mean that there's somewhere they can go to have a conversation and get advice on how to proceed. So that's number two after the insights piece. Also looking at, and this is one of the things that's interesting about a global role, is how do you scale support globally? So despite my honest view is there aren't that many global health and wellbeing solutions. Once you factor in the need for language support, is in theory relatively easy, but it needs to be real translation, not stuff run through Google Translate, because people spot that and feel a bit aggrieved by it, understandably, because they feel like they're getting a product that's not ready for them. And then you have cultural sensitivity. So, in some countries, a menopause article written for the UK will not translate very well, because there are cultural differences. And there's not only cultural difference, there's also, every country has a different medical system, different healthcare system, different attitudes to health. So how do you find something that works on that scale? And in some cases, the answer might be there isn't one. In some cases, that might mean working with a partner to develop something. And then also being transparent, we need to sort of trade that off against what's the most important from a demographic perspective. Where is our focus going to be that year? Because there's a 1,000 things we want to do. And so we have to sort of prioritize them as well. But fundamentally looking to create a workplace where people feel comfortable acknowledging the challenge and understand the challenge of the menopause. And I don't just mean people going through the menopause, I mean the people they're working with as well. Because if it's happening to someone on your team, then it's affecting you as well. We want to make sure people feel supported in dealing with that. And the last thing is financial wellbeing, which we've really framed around financial education. So we have a very good partner in this space, who have genuinely got a global kind of offering. And what we're looking at is offering, so financial education is quite scary once you get your head around it. So I think it's something like 16% of people have any kind of formal financial education growing up. And I suspect that kind of intersects quite heavily with a sort of a class and wealth perspective as well. So most people are kind of fumbling around in the dark when it comes to money, unless they're very driven and self-educated. There's also a lot of people out there offering things which, there's a lot of snake oil out there, basically. So the partner we use, very impartial, don't offer any products. It's all about giving people financial literacy. But this is yet another thing we've introduced into the workplace. So a big part of my role for the next 2 years is really how we make sure people get the most out of that, and how we as an organisation get the most out of the organisation we're partnering with. We've done a good job on that in the UK. We've got very good engagement in the UK. So it's how do we take those lessons and apply them? And we're kind of it's a bit like going, I've done it in the UK and now I've gone back to square one in the global, which again is exciting. It's an interesting challenge. And it's another example of, I'll probably find myself saying the same things, different groups of people lots of times over. But we know that drives engagement. If you can find those messages that land with people and you can tailor them to different groups. I think one of the great things at Accenture is we've created this capacity globally to actually go and really work with countries, work with big projects to actually do tailored sessions for them. So actually we can get people to understand these supports and lean into them. And again, going back to my earlier point, at the same time, that's demonstrating that your project lead or your account lead or your business lead recognizes the importance of these and recognizes the importance of self-care, versus it being something that's kind of lobbed to you in a comms, but feels like it's completely separate from the day-to-day business, which, well-being can't be. It's got to be part of your culture and how you work.
Yeah. Underpins everything, doesn't it?
So
fun.
Yeah. So no, it's an exciting time. It's an interesting place to work. It's an interesting industry to work in. I don't know how some people get any work done with the amount of time they spend on LinkedIn.
Probably batting off loads of people wanting to work with you as well. I can imagine I've been heard that's quite a thing.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting. You do get approached a lot, and the things that I'm going to go inverse. The worst way to engage me is to send me an email going, "Have you got time for a meeting in the next couple of days?" And it's kind of like that's the least empathetic thing I've ever received. It's like, no, that's not how my diary works. The second worst way to engage me is to start off by slagging off things like EAPs, which, whilst they're not perfect, by the stretch of imagination, do make a difference, do save lives. So trying to differentiate yourself by sort of slagging off what's already there, I don't think it's a good way to go. The reality is generally we will know when we want something. So it's quite hard to cold call an organization like Accenture. Another classic is pilots. People are like, we'll offer you a free pilot. And my attitude's always like, okay, but unless I have the money at the end of the free pilot to buy the thing, all I've done is potentially create a big rod for my own back. Because if everyone loves it, but we can't afford it, or we haven't got approval to roll it out, then the pilot doesn't mean anything. So we will pilot things, but we'll only pilot things again when we're at the point where we think it's we know we're in a position to scale it. I think it's going to be really interesting with things like AI, as to how that can help with scalable solutions. And I know some people will get scared of that lack of human component, but we know fundamentally that most of the best healthcare solutions work best on a one-to-one basis where you're talking to a real person. You can get clinical tailored advice. If you're talking to the right person, a real person, that's the best solution. Unfortunately, there's not enough of those people.
No, that also does it. It's also very expensive.
Yeah, it is. It's very expensive, absolutely. So I do genuinely think there is a role that, trained on the right data by the right people, AI can play in bringing more. And again, not for everything. So for acute health issues, you still be talking individuals, but maybe cases where people are well but want a bit of advice, or people I just feel like they're heading in the wrong direction, and can be signposted to things that will help them. I think that's going to be really interesting. But yeah, the short version is I get approached an awful lot, and I try and be polite as possible. I try and say no as politely as possible. But where I can, I will try and make time for people just to give them a point of view on what I think companies are looking for, especially big companies. And that goes back to that scalability piece, which is people of our size ideally do want global solutions. We want things that people can access in their own language. We want things that feel culturally relevant, both from from everything from imagery to content. So if you're let's say in India, and you log into something and everyone looks like they live on the west coast of America, then it's immediately disengaging. But far more important, ultimately, even though I think that is important, is the content's got to be relevant to where you live. Assuming it's something with content. And then behind that, as you get deeper, it's also things like if you do have specialists sitting behind something, are they licensed to actually deliver clinical advice in those countries, for example? Because there's lots of guidelines there. And so if you have someone based in the UK, say a psychologist, and through an app they're speaking to someone in the Philippines, it's probably not technically covered by clinical governance. So there's some interesting lines there as well in terms of this stuff. But yeah, my inbox is fairly busy, but that's quite flattering, so I shouldn't complain too much.
Yeah, and I guess the best way to get in contact with you is to be in the place you're going to be every week, standing there waiting to say hello when you walk in. So that's
I mean, you played the long game by being at the same thing as I am.
Yeah, my place to work.
Yeah,
but no, yeah, 100%. And I know we've had the conversations, and that scalability piece is probably one of the biggest challenges, right? Having to support many employees over many different cultures is probably, as you said, I alluded to earlier on, within the kind of challenges of what you're facing. One of the hardest bits.
It is, but I think it's also a great lesson in how to sort of ultimately approach well-being, because I think you need to listen. You need to, I mean, it really about designing any kind of, I think, program for people. You need to acknowledge that you might be some kind of an expert in how to sort of design these programs or to get change done, but you're not an expert. You can't be an expert or as close to these people as people in those communities. You've got to listen to those. It's got to be an exercise in collaboration. Even as equally from a kind of a vendor perspective, it's got to be an exercise in partnership, because, as I say, you're probably not going to be able to find the perfect product. So what you need to be able to find is the right people to work with, who will work with you, over time to deliver. So, for example, our financial wellbeing program on day one, 100% of almost all countries have personalized content, but there's a few that weren't covered, but they will all have them within the next 18 months. So we were comfortable with that compromise because that was as close as we could get, but the partner was willing to work with us to get to 100%. So there's that, that element of sort of finding the right partners, I think, is really important. And then the last big thing, which not talked about so much, is sponsorship. So it's having leaders who will generally sort of back you to do these things and will echo the importance of these things, because otherwise, they won't land.
Yeah. That was going to be one of my questions, but you were given so much information elsewhere, and I know we're nearly at the hour mark already, so I won't take up any more of your time. There is one last question, which I did pre-warn you about, which I ask every single person who comes onto this podcast, is what your top 3 take-home bits of advice are, whether that's for somebody in your role or somebody looking at wellbeing. What's your take-home bits of advice?
So, I mean, we've talked about measurement a lot. Measure what you can. If you're starting in one of these roles, try and baseline so you know where you're starting from, because then you'll be able to measure success a lot more easily. I said it earlier, don't be afraid to repeat yourself. I think getting people's attention is hard. And well-being, unfortunately, isn't always as high up people's lists as it should be. And obviously part of the role is to try and change that perception as well, but you also need to deal with where you are. So, have a strong core set of simple messages versus trying to reinvent the wheel every 10 minutes because, for the sake of innovation. And then I think I'll finish on a more personal note. I think the thing I've sort of learned the hard way is have a broad definition of success. So success should not just be about work. It also needs to be about your well-being, your family life, your hobbies, he says, pointing at the shelves behind him. And if you can help both for yourself and your people have a sense of success that is broader than just work promotion, then I think that leads to sort of a healthier workplace and also a sort of a better mental space as well for you as a person.
Do you know what? You're not the first person when I ask that question to who reflects back on looking after themselves And I think people, especially within your role, and actually I recall back to a few people who've said that within, like, it's a hard place to be. Make sure you look after yourself because you turn
Yeah,
up there.
100%. Because the reality is there will always be more to do in these roles. Wellbeing is a never-ending journey. I know it's a total trite cliche, but you have to put your own oxygen mask on first. You're not going to be able to. Also, change is hard and takes time. So if you want to see that change through, you've got to be working in a sustainable way, which means you've got to sort of set your boundaries. And that's again where I come back to having that broad definition of success, because that's something I now use for boundary setting. Because I could throw myself into work, 24 hours a day, but that will ruin my relationships and ruin my health. And then a couple of months later, I'll be throwing myself into work 0 hours a day because I'll be back to where I was 7-8 years ago and signed off again, which is somewhere I'm keen to avoid.
Yeah, 100%. Really agree with you. Paul, I appreciate your time. I appreciate you sharing all this information. I think it's been very valuable, and there's some really good learning points for people to take away. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. And for coming on looking like we do, I think that's also very powerful. And also, for sharing your story to start with, I appreciate that. I think I probably threw under the bus a little bit there, but no, thank you again. The next Wellbeing chat is at the beginning of December with I never remember how to say his name, Kunte, from Vodafone, who's going to be talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how you can support that within the workplace. It'd be really interesting one. So if you're still watching at 5:30, well done. Go on to that one as well. Otherwise, we'll see you soon. Thank you, Paul, again, and stay there. But see you all soon. Take care. Bye bye.
Thank you.